Hello, and welcome to Segmenting Publics in a Crisis. When we review our definition of a crisis, it states very clearly that a crisis can affect the organization as well as its publics. So who are the publics for an organization in a crisis situation? How do we define them? And how do we break them down into manageable parts? That's what we're going to discuss in this lecture. In all public relations planning, we must identify our specific audiences and then segment them according to mutual interests. We know there is no general public, where we lump everyone together into one group. We must break these large segments into smaller, more manageable parts, and this is known as audience segmentation, which is based on the idea that different groups of people have different characteristics that influence what is important to them, what they want to pay attention to, and what messages they will act upon. In communicating with our various audiences, we, as PR practitioners, must determine which communication channels are likely to be more effective in reaching our intended audience. This is known as targeting, in which we identify the various audience segments and then choose which channels of communication are the best to reach that audience group. Targeting uses the premise that certain groups respond better to certain types of communication. An example of this is that most of you are more likely to respond to a Facebook post than an article in the Florida Times-Union. When we look at communicating during and after a crisis, we must identify and target our key publics. Although all publics need to be notified in a crisis situation, we do have some specific publics that should be notified first, if at all possible. And we are going to segment these key publics into 4 different categories. The first is enabling publics. These are people with the power and authority to make decisions. These people are your decision makers, so to speak, such as the CEO, the vice president, the chairman of the board, or anyone with complete authority in your organization. Second are the functional publics. These are the people who actually make the organization work. They include what I call the worker bees, the day-to-day employees, the vendors or suppliers of goods, the volunteers at a nonprofit organization, or even the consumers of your company's goods and services. Without these people, the organization could not function or run. Third is the normative publics, people who share values with the organization, especially in a crisis situation. These people are not part of the day-to-day work environment, but they are very important to your organization. These people could be your company's trade or professional or associations, other businesses that depend on your company, or even donors or sponsors for a nonprofit organization. Normative publics can also be direct competitors or companies which are similar to yours. A crisis that occurs to your company could also occur to them, so they are very interested in how you handle it. The fourth is diffuse publics. These are people who are indirectly linked to the organization. This is the hardest group to categorize, but the media are always a diffused public. The media become involved indirectly with your organization in the event of a crisis because there is a story for them to share with their audience. Other diffused publics could be the community leaders in your city, if your organization isn't a government-related crisis, the surrounding neighborhoods close to your company's location, or even other businesses in the community who don't work with your organization directly, but are interested in the crisis and how your company is handling it. In looking at our categories, one can see that the enabling and functional publics are considered internal audiences. for your organization, in that they are directly associated with it. And the normative and diffuse publics serve as external audiences to the organization because they are outside of the company and are not as closely connected to it. In most crisis situations, your internal audience needs to have more immediate communication other than an external audience. So most, if not all, beginning communication needs to be directed toward an internal audience. However, if the media finds out about the crisis even before you do, then your first communication may be to the media and then your internal audiences. An example of this situation came when U.S. Airways Flight 1549 had to make an emergency landing in the Hudson River in New York. Twitter and Facebook posts and some video were already being uploaded showing the plane in the river, even before U.S. Air or the National Transportation Safety Board, the NTSB, were informed. Some key officials found out about this crisis through their own Twitter feeds. So now that we've identified our various publics, what do we need to know about them? What kind of relationship do we need to have with them? What kind of communication do they want and need from us during a crisis situation? Let's see. First, let's look at our relationships to our publics or key stakeholders. Stakeholders are people who are linked to the organization, have an interest in the organization, or are affected by the decisions of the organization. The term stakeholder falls under all four of our public categories. However, what is the relationship we have with our stakeholders? It can either be a positive one or just the opposite, a negative one. In a positive relationship, both the organization and its key publics understand, acknowledge, communicate, and listen to one another. An example of a positive relationship is the one Google has with its employees. Google has consistently been named by Fortune magazine as the best place to work. And besides its employees, Google has a relationship with its customers as well. How many of you use and trust Google as your primary search engine? On the other hand, companies can have negative relationships with their employees because of low wages, threats of layoffs, or poor working conditions, and have negative relationships with their customers because of quality issues with their products or just terrible customer service. According to yearly surveys done by 24/7 Wall Street, companies like Comcast, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Sprint, just to name a few, are constantly considered some of the most hated companies in America. So even before a crisis occurs, a company must develop positive relationships with its key stakeholders, both internal and external. Once the crisis happens, it may be too late to repair any damage that has already been cast. In communicating with your various publics, the facts are important, but one must also understand that people have very genuine concerns, and just reporting the facts about the crisis may not be enough to quell your public's anxieties regarding this crisis. So let's look at some key publics and their concerns. Your immediate internal publics are going to make it personal. They're concerned about themselves, their family members, their safety, their jobs, and how will this affect their lives. And in natural disasters, they're even concerned about their pets. For emergency personnel or law enforcement, their concern is always the safety of the public and how they can respond to and/or recover any victims. Family members, family first. Are their loved ones safe? And how does this crisis interrupt their normal daily lives and routine? Government or civic leaders, how does this look for their city or state? Does it affect their reputation, travel, or tourism? Do they have the resources to cover this crisis? What is the liability? Does new legislation need to be created in regards to this crisis? Other trade association or similar industries, how will this affect the business in general? Do their companies need to make changes in procedures or guidelines as a result of this crisis? Media. Well, they want the facts of this crisis, and they want access to key spokespeople for information and quotes. And they are concerned about their deadlines because they have to get their stories up and running to their audiences. Basically, when communicating with all of your key publics, you need to know 6 core values that concern everyone when bad news occurs. Health and safety, who's hurt and what are the health hazards, possession and property, what's the damage to my property or business and who's going to pay for it, environmental concerns, how does this affect the environment, both plants and animals, as well as humans, peer concerns, what will people think, what will other companies think, will people and or other companies still want to do business with our organization, economic security, how much is this going to cost? And can the company cover this loss of revenue and still survive? And finally, quality of life, peace of mind and reassurance. This is probably the hardest yet most important communication an organization can give to its publics, reassuring them that everything will be all right. As we discussed in the previous module, your messages are important. Make sure that what you are saying in response to the crisis is done quickly and accurately, is credible and trustworthy, and given by a spokesperson who is perceived as credible and who shows compassion for the people and communities affected by this crisis. Remember, the first responses in a crisis situation lay the groundwork for how the crisis will be viewed by the media and by the key stakeholders. In closing, communication with your publics begins even before a crisis occurs. Your company's corporate culture must be one that understands, knows, and has a positive relationship with its key publics and stakeholders. Otherwise, your company's overall reputation could be jeopardized, and it may never recover.